Everybody's discussed a reduction in the estate tax exclusion, which is currently 11.7 million, and is almost certain to go down in the future. When? We don't know. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that will also result in a reduction in the GST tax exemption. Now, GST planning is going to become even more important then, especially because portability does not preserve the unused GST exemption. But a lot of planning in the last 10 years has been geared towards creation of marital trusts. Now, when we look at marital trusts, only a QTIP marital trust is optimal for GST tax planning because of the reverse QTIP election. Now, for existing marital trusts that are not currently GST exempt, spouses may want to consider gifting their interest in those trusts to use their unused GST exemption before it goes away. I'm Griffin Bridgers, and this is 10 Minutes with Griffin. For today's episode, episode 168, we're going to discuss the GST tax, marital trusts, and reverse QTIP elections, and see how those fit together. Now, as always, this presentation is not intended to substitute for legal or tax advice and is provided for educational purposes only. And if you'd like a copy of these slides, please email me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com. So, what are marital trusts? I've discussed these in previous episodes, but they're trusts that qualify for the gift or estate tax marital deduction. Generally, they're structured as life estate equivalent trusts. Now, there's two types of trusts where either there's a general power of appointment granted to the surviving spouse, or there's no general power of appointment, but there's an elective marital deduction that can be made through the QTIP election. Now, what's important is that the assets of the trust for which the marital deduction is taken will be included in the surviving spouse's gross estate, either by virtue of the general power of appointment or by virtue of the QTIP election that has been made. Now, importantly, if you want to have a QTIP marital trust, you can't give the spouse a general power of appointment. Now, that estate inclusion in general causes a problem when it comes to GST tax planning, because generally when somebody is funding a trust, as would be the case with a decedent here whose estate is funding a marital trust, then no GST tax exemption can be applied if there is the potential that that trust will be included in the gross estate of a beneficiary upon that beneficiary's death. And I say potential, it's more that there's a certainty that that will occur. And what happens there is that there's this estate tax inclusion period, or ETIP, that lapses once the beneficiary dies. Now, this is a problem in marital trust because generally it would appear to make it impossible for the first spouse to die to allocate their GST tax exemption to the trust, since that trust will be included in the gross estate of the surviving spouse. But what we're going to see is that that's only an issue for general power of appointment trusts. So where would you see this issue pop up? One would be in a situation where maybe you have an AB formula in an estate plan that funds a credit shelter trust first before funding a marital trust, but after funding the credit shelter trust, there's unused GST tax exemption remaining. Another issue that would pop up is a situation where instead of an AB formula, the estate plan funds solely a marital trust with audibles, as we discussed in a previous episode, for portability or a disclaimer, a partial QTIP election, or a Clayton QTIP election. In either of those scenarios, what you're going to run into is a situation where GST tax exemption needs to be allocated to the marital trust if you want to preserve it. Now, there is a solution as long as you have a marital trust that qualifies for the QTIP election. In that case, there's an election solely for GST tax purposes known as the reverse QTIP election. Now, the reverse QTIP election doesn't affect the estate tax and doesn't affect the marital deduction, but what it does, it allows that marital trust to avoid the estate tax inclusion period problem. So, the estate of the first spouse to die can allocate GST tax exemption to that portion of the marital trust for which the reverse QTIP election is made, and when the surviving spouse dies, even though that trust is included in the surviving spouse's gross estate, the surviving spouse doesn't allocate any of their own GST tax exemption to that trust. Instead, the GST tax exempt status of that reverse QTIP portion of the marital trust is preserved at the survivor's death. And if there's any part of the marital trust that exceeds the first spouse's unused GST exemption, you could make a partial reverse QTIP election, which would allow the survivor to use their own GST tax exemption, either at death or, as we're going to see, during life. So here's an example. Let's assume the first spouse to die has made significant lifetime non-skip gifts, and as a result has the following tax attributes at death. There's $1 million in unused estate tax exclusion and $10 million in unused GST tax exemption. Now, the estate plan transfers everything, and we're going to assume $50 million here to a marital trust, which will qualify for a QTIP election. So, what planning options are there for the personal representative or executor to optimize transfer tax planning in this $50 million trust? So there's some permutations we can walk through here. The marital trust will be divided into generally 3 shares. There will be a GST exempt share, but within that there will be a portion for which a reverse QTIP election is made, which will be $10 million. There will be a portion for which no QTIP election is made of $10 million or $1 million. And then in the GST non-exempt share of $39 million, there'd be a QTIP election for the entire balance of that trust. So what happens is that from an estate tax perspective, there's $1 million for which no QTIP election is made. The remaining $49 million has a QTIP election made. But then of that $49 million, we back out $10 million and make a reverse QTIP election for it. So we're going to look at fractions here. At the survivor's death, 49/50ths of the balance of the marital trust will be included in the survivor's gross estate, but 10/50ths of that would remain exempt from the GST tax, and the remaining 39/50ths could use the surviving spouse's unused GST tax exemption. Now, what if the survivor doesn't want to wait until death? What if we run into a seemingly likely scenario where the GST tax exemption may go down? What can the survivor do with that remaining 39/50ths? Well, in this case, what the spouse has is a life estate, and they can gift that, maybe through a non-qualified disclaimer of a portion of that trust, or maybe through a release, or whatever state law allows. That's especially the case when you look to the remainder beneficiaries of that trust and see GST potential, either for living skip persons or the inclusion of descendants as remainder beneficiaries in the future in a dynasty trust who might be skip persons. So if the spouse releases or disclaims their portion of this marital trust, and it's a non-qualified disclaimer, that would be treated as a lifetime gift of the present value of the life estate that was given to the spouse. And that would use both the gift tax applicable credit and the GST tax exemption before those go down or go away. Now, if you want to see how that present value is calculated, refer back to some of my previous episodes on estate planning calculations. But long story short, the higher the 75/20 rate at the time of this gift, the higher the present value of the remainder based on the life expectancy of the spouse. Now, what you're having to do is strike a balance here if you're using this strategy. If you wait, the 75/20 rate seems like it will go up, but waiting may put you up against the wall in terms of the reduction of a GST exemption and when that might take effect, especially if there's a retroactive type of tax law change as many people have discussed. So there's no hard and fast answer there, it's just a balancing act. But long story short, with marital trusts, there are a couple GST audibles we have here in terms of the reverse QTIP election, and then maybe even a lifetime gift or holding until death to use the surviving spouse's unused GST tax exemption. As always, if you have questions or topic suggestions, you can email those to me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com. But thank you for listening to this episode of 10 Minutes with Griffin, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.